it is just fascinating to think about it, that we would be able at some point to evoke a memory that is not even there. Because if we think the memory as a combination of synaptic communications, maybe some structural things, you should be able to insert a memory in a specific part of the brain, even if it's never been there.
Dr. Diaz, great to have you back. Give us a reminder of who you are and your experience in neuroscience.
Sure. So originally a biochemist from Chile. So then I got a PhD in neuroscience, and I came to US to do to work on my thesis at NIH. Then after that, I did a couple of postdocs working in neuroscience, and then I became a research associate faculty in Hopkins. So always working in aspects of the neuroscience related with synaptic communications, basically to try to understand how neurons talk with each other, how neurons develop from when you are, an embryo all the way to an adult or to a functional human being, right? So always focused on basically the talking of neurons. That I always thought it was fascinating to try to understand how they whisper to each other and how we can take information from them in the lab. So that's what I always thought it was fascinating for me.
Absolutely. And as a neuroscientist, speaking of memory, as a neuroscientist, what's the scientific definition of memory?
Well, there are many, in terms of memory, there are so many different currents. Some people think one way, some people think another, and all of them have like a very strong arguments. But it's basically the ability to capture, to store, and then to remember, a fact, right? So, and that is supposed to be kept inside of your brain, kind of like in a file cabinet.
To recall, to reach back in experiences, information that you've gotten, and pull that back out for future use.
Exactly. And that was the main thing that I think I mentioned this to you before, but the fact that got me into neuroscience, it was when you do an effort to try to remember something and you get it. And I always thought that was fascinating. The fact when you say, I have it in the tip of my tongue, and you try to remember and you make an effort and sometimes when you're folding your laundry, it's like, oh, I got it. So it's like, how did I do that? So the information was in there, and kind of like a little people inside of my brain is kind of like going through files, and at some point they're like, we cannot find it. And at some point it's like, we got it. This is the name of the actor you were thinking about. So I always thought that was so fascinating, and that was one of the main things that got me into neuroscience.
Well, I want to get into what you think the answer to that is. But first, before we do that, let's talk about the brain structures that are involved in memory. What are the key brain structures in the brain?
When we talk about memory, usually we talk about the hippocampus. Kind of like that's the central thing. But everything actually in the brain is part of memory. All of the structures, somehow participate in memory, storage, and then the recalling part. So if you talk about more kind of like a executive function, you talk about more the cortex, the frontal lobe. If you talk about emotion, usually the memories are not a fact, right? So it's not kind of like a number and then you would keep it in your brain forever. Usually it's associated with other things, right? So like if associated with emotions, you get the amygdala, If it's things that you don't take, you don't have to think about, like tie your shoes, like the typical riding a bike, those kinds of things. You involve other structures, right? So like the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, So when we think about memory, the people usually think about the hippocampus, like the people who is a little bit more associated with with the brain. They say, oh, the hippocampus is it, but actually it's everything. Everything is associated with storage and recalling memories.
So is it different structures that are working with the hippocampus? You had mentioned the amygdala, and that's more the fight or flight, the stuff like that. That works in tune with the hippocampus to create.
Yep, everything is connected at some point, right? So you get kind of like the cortex and the hippocampus, are extremely connected. You get in the same hippocampus, you get these connections. You get the typical CA3, CA2, CA1. And those connections, they're super studied, right? So everything is connected somehow. So you have these super long neurons, that kind of like cover the whole brain structure. You had one kind of neuron that I always thought it was fascinating. Rosa Cossard from France, she described them for the first time, the HAP cells, that they were kind of like these neurons that were kind of like controlling the whole thing, and they were so long that they will cover basically the whole brain structure.
Wow. One neuron cell.
Just only one neuron. So yeah, we always think on the neurons, it's like these tiny, very tiny microscopic things, But yeah, if you think some neurons are millimeters long, and some, they are very long. If you think on DRG neurons, the dorsal root ganglion neurons, they are super long.
Yeah.
They're super, super long. So it's like it's a bit of everything, and that's fascinating too. All the neurons are different. All of them have different functions, so all of them have different behaviors, and they are everywhere. So, and there are so many things that we don't even know. There is the Connectome Project, right, to try to understand how all the different structures of the brain are talking with each other, and that's going on right now. And it's crazy. It's crazy to think how a structure that is, in terms of brain, right, so many miles away from each other, and they're still talking,
Right.
and they can have relays, right? So it's not like they can be talking directly many times, but sometimes you have different structures, that are in between,
Yeah.
So
there's confusion between long-term and short-term memory and stuff like that, working memory. Is that because it's coming from different brain structures? Help define that.
Yeah. So like usually when we talk about memory, we talk about two main things, right? Long-term memory and short-term memory, and then you have like these subdivisions inside, right? So the short-term memory is basically what you need to, I don't know, if you're, the typical example is you're crossing the street, right? And then you look to one side, and then you see a car coming, and then you look to the other side, and then you see another car coming, and then you have to calculate if you have enough time to cross the street. So you have to remember where the other car was, right? So like a short-term memory, you have short-term memory that's 30 seconds and low, right? So you don't need to remember the IKEA instructions. You just need to know that the A1 go together with B1, right? And then you just do it, and you don't need to remember that your whole life. So that's kind of like a very practical memory that is super usable, but it's short, right? So, and then you have this long-term memory that is the one that you are going to use for more, I don't know, more specific things, that are more fancy, if we can give it a name, in terms of recalling specific things, names, situations, smells, like everything, all those things that will evoke something that you will need, can we distinguish very well between those two? I don't know.
As far as where they're located in the brain?
Yeah. So like, of course, there is the amnesia. Is a very well studied, and the hippocampus is central in those things. And people that has kind of like a very short term memory problems that they cannot. I remember there was a case of this epilepsy patient, and that was in a podcast. I think it's a Malcolm Gladwell podcast, and she had a tumor, or yes, she had a tumor in her brain, and it was resected, right? So her problem, she could, at some point, she could feel, she had kind of like an aura and she could feel when the seizure would come. So she realized that she could run, and then the seizure would go away. It's kind of like your own vagal nerve stimulation, right? So it's like, oh, it's coming. So you start running. And she would start running, and the seizure wouldn't come. So she became one of these runners that they ran for kind of like super long distances. I don't remember what is the specific names, but her issue was that after they removed the part of the brain, she couldn't remember. Kind of like her short-term memory was affected. So the advantage for this super runner was that she wouldn't remember how long she was running. So it was kind of like the psychological, effect of knowing how long you have been running, and kind of like you getting overwhelmed. It's like, I have been running for so many hours. I'm so tired, but
she didn't have that.
She didn't have that. And then she would describe in these kind of like a super marathons that she was running, and then, you have those maps and you have signs. And then at some point she would get kind of like a wide part of the road, and she was like, I have to take this. And then she would realize that she took the wrong one. And then she would come back and then take the other one. And still she would win, because she didn't have to deal with her own pressure. And I thought that was fascinating. That's one of my favorite episodes.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It's incredible. So can you separate it? Yeah, maybe. Maybe we can kind of like dissect it very specifically. And her long-term memory was perfect. It's like you have seen the video of this, that is very popular video of this lady who has dementia. And she was part of the Bolshoi, I think. And she can barely talk. And then they put the music. And then suddenly she starts moving and doing the same steps, as she was doing as a ballerina when she was in her 20s.
Yeah.
And now she's like 90. And again, she cannot even talk, but she can still dance. So where is that stored that is different to the other things? It's like in a file cabinet that is way inside of your brain, so you cannot reach to it. How do you do it? I don't know. So yeah, maybe we can separate between, but I think it's very difficult.
And it's not like car diagnostics where you can, test a wire and see what the other, or even with an EMG where you can test one nerve and see what the output is on the other.
Yeah.
In the brain, it's almost where you have to, something has to happen with the patient, whether they have a lesion or a tumor or whatever the case may be in a certain part of the brain, and something significant like short-term memory, they lose their short-term memory happens, then that's when they're studied.
Exactly.
Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. I mean, we're far away from being able to measure specifically, where in the brain. I mean, now we have kind of like a brain electrodes and things like that we can use to measure specific areas. But as an EEG expert, all those things are just part of the story, right?
Yeah.
So we could measure the synaptic communication, the neuronal communication, but it's still field potentials.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not that you can. It's not like when we do in vitro, right? So in vitro, I could patch two cells, specifically two cells, and then stimulate one and get the answer in the other one.
Right.
So at the level of the brain, we won't be able to we will be able. We are not yet, to kind of do a super specific recording to try to understand those things. But it is just fascinating to think about it, that we would be able at some point to even to evoke a memory that is not even there.
Yeah.
Because if we think the memory as a combination of, synaptic communications, maybe some structural things, you should be able to insert a memory in a specific part of the brain, even if it's never been there. Right? So it is just crazy to think about it.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Scary and fascinating.
It's scary. It's
Because
scary.
if you get a memory, a bad actor, sometimes my brain goes there. If a bad actor, you know, captures someone and inserts a memory that didn't happen, that could be problematic.
Yeah, it was mind blowing for me to watch The Matrix for the first time.
Oh yeah.
I was like, what? I mean, could this be doable? Like, is this possible? Like in the future, that they could just connect you and kind of like a software, you put some words in there. It's like, this is you and these are your memories,
Right.
and that's crazy to think about it. But
And we don't know much. I mean, relatively speaking, in different organs, the brain is the most unresearched, I guess, or we don't know as much about the brain as we do, say, the liver or the
Yep.
heart or something like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's first you have so many different structures in the brain. So you have billions and billions of neurons and billions of synaptic communications. So how do you start?
Right.
Trying to understand that. That's super difficult even to think about it.
Yeah.
Right. So how I don't know if you heard. We always grew up with the idea that neurons cannot be reborn, right? So like if you destroy a neuron, that's when your mother used to say to you, yeah, you don't kill your neurons,
they won't go back.
Yeah, they won't go back. Exactly. So we know there are some areas of the brain, that you see kind of like yeah, exactly. But most of the parts you don't, right? So like if you think on what happens in the brain, when you get rid of some neurons, something that we call plasticity, right? So if you get rid of some neurons, and how does the brain wires again to cover that area, right? So like the typical example is when people lose, I don't know, movement of a limb, right? So they get on a stroke and they get paralyzed in one side, and they can learn how to move it again. So how does the brain do that to kind of like fix that circuit that was broken? And if you think on it, it's crazy because it's like there is a little person in there, a handyman fixing the things, to get it to work again.
Right.
So then we go to kind of like a deeper memory now. It's like your system had a memory of how that used to work, so they can build it again. And that's a whole other theory of memory, because this theory of memory, that memory is not just the brain, but all the things surrounding it. And a lot of people is not.
Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so there is this kind of like a full theory of that memory is not just your brain and the combination of communications, but it's the environment too. So basically, memory could be everything. It's not just a single thing. It's a little bit like when we talk about genes and epigenetic, right? So the memory, that you would have in one place shouldn't be the same memory that you have in another place.
Right.
So it's like because everything is affecting it. I think it's crazy. It's kind of like a more philosophical, if you want. But I think, I had a professor who used to tell me, if you can say it, it is possible. So it's like I remember when I started working kind of like in coding, those things that I was never good at that in MATLAB. I was describing to the guy how to make a system to analyze one kind of recording that I had. That was so difficult to analyze with the tools that we had at that point. So I was describing it, and I was like, at some point, I was like, yeah, I know it's really hard, like I don't think you can do it. He was like, if you can say it, I can put it in the coding. So I think in the brain it could be something like that.
I remember this actually just happened to me not too long ago. For whatever reason, when I was in grade school, I grew up in a small town, and we had one theater, and it had like 2 screens.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I entered that cinema, there was a mixture of popcorn and candies, and just, it was an older building, so that older smell as well. And just recently, not too long ago, for whatever reason, I experienced that same mixture. It was the popcorn and it was something else. And the memory of the carpet of that place, for whatever reason, popped into my head. It's like I walked into that again. And I remember the carpet, which I would have never have thought or even would have imagined that I remembered that
Mm-hmm.
or took that information in and stored it somewhere. And so going back to when you're saying memory might be more than just the brain,
Yep.
it's perception and maybe experience and
Yep.
all that tuned into your hippocampus, or your hippocampus is tuned into that.
Yep.
And so is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's so mysterious and fascinating, and exciting to think that we can do those things. Like I have had the same feeling, many times. Like when you get a combination of things, and it's like, oh, this is just like when I was riding my bike, when I was 5. So that's amazing that we can do that. Like I don't know if you have tried to do this, but I always try to remember smells.
Yes.
And you can do it.
That's the biggest one for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's difficult, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you try to imagine, I don't know, if you do the exercise, mint. How does mint smell?
Yeah.
And it takes some time, like it's not easy, but you can get there.
You can get there.
So it's like if you can do that, that is something that is an external stimulus, and you can evoke that. That means that you can, in theory, do anything. I always make fun with I have a chat, WhatsApp chat with my high school friends. Many of them, I know them since I was, 9. And for many of them, I remember their phone numbers. So I said to them, you remember this number? And they haven't had that number. So many times they don't even remember it. And I don't know why. I would love to know how I did it. So what combination of ingredients I put in there to get that memory in there that is forever there.
Yeah.
And now, you tell me your name, and it's like, like 5 minutes later, it's like, okay, what was your name?
Same here.
Yeah, but or like features of your face, I'm so good at that. And my family always makes fun of me because I say things like, do you see that person? She was the person, who was eating ice cream, like 3 blocks away. So she's coming with, so I always say to them, I should have worked in the FBI, because I remember the faces so well, but if they tell me their name, I'm done.
And it's interesting because I know people who remember names like crazy, and I'm always fascinated by those people. And it's really perception, what you take in and what you choose to remember.
Exactly.
I know that this is just a theory of how neurons can store and retrieve information. What is your input on that?
Yeah, so there is a lot in that field, and it's, again, as you said, it's all theory right now. There are 2 phenomena that you can see in the lab. One is called the long-term potentiation, and the other one is called the long-term depression. And there are other ones, right? So, and they go, they have to do with what we talked about before, about plasticity, right? So, in theory, what it could be happening is that for a long time it was believed that synapses that work together kind of like grow together, and they make kind of like those circuits stronger. And that's how you basically, that's why I mentioned before, it could be a mix of synaptic communication, but also structural changes, right? So it is believed that long-term potentiation would be a way, in a very simplistic way, right? So it would be a way how to make synaptic connection stronger. And you can do that in the lab. You can do a specific pattern of stimulation between, for example, in the hippocampus, right? The typical one, CA3, CA1, that are two areas of the hippocampus. You do a stimulation in one side, and then you record in the other side. And it is known the kinds of patterns that you have to use to stimulate in order for this cell to start answering harder.
Wow.
So you can see that, and you can see that you have in currents, you see kind of like you can measure the size of the current of those cells, right?
And you're doing this in the lab.
Yeah, with a slice. You cut a slice of the brain, and then you put an stimulator in one side and another pipette that will be a recorder, right? And then you can try to mimic basically what it could be happening in the brain in terms of stimulation, when you have an external stimulation. So you do the stimulation, and there are different patterns that you can use, and they always work. So it's like you can say, okay, so if I do it this way, with this frequency, this number of stimulations for this duration, I can get that cell to answer more. You see, and that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Like and that LTP, the long-term potentiation, can last for so long. So you can imagine if that could be the source of how you make a memory. Basically, an stimulation would produce that, an external stimulus would produce that kind of stimulation in the brain that at the end will end up with a stronger answer, or response of that other cell, what we call the postsynaptic cell. On the other hand, you have long-term depression, and you can do that in the lab too. You can do a specific pattern of stimulation, and you can make this postsynaptic response smaller with time, and you can get it to last for a long time. So if you think very simplistic way, those are just two different patterns. You have others, you have facilitation, that you have so many different patterns. But if you think, with LTP, you can create a stronger synapse, and with LTD, you can weaken that synapse. That could be a way how to kind of like, you may think, oh, if I can do this, with the specific things, with the specific parts of the whole circuit, I could make parts stronger. I could make parts weaker, and that's how I could maybe code for a memory, right? And that is all together with so those stimulations that will produce an LTP, for example, at the end may result in a structural change. So you get the synaptic spines, for example, that is usually in the dendrites. You have these little structures, right? That they look like a spine, and those are the places where you are supposed to have the synaptic contact. So a part of the axon will connect to that synaptic spines. So we have seen in the lab, that you can change the number of dendritic spines, based on so many different things. So you can say, okay, so the LTP, LTD, you can change the response of the cells, plus you can add the structural changes. So that could be how you encode memory. But that could be just part of it, right? So we don't really know how much of that is just memory, right? So could be more things affecting. But it's fascinating. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, that is fascinating. We've talked about memory. Let's talk about forgetting. Is forgetting an active process? Like, does the brain want us to forget things at times?
And that's super interesting. So I don't know if I can give you kind of like 100% answer, but I can tell you about a little bit what I think and what is believed. For a long time, it was believed that the forgetting, it was the absence of remembering, right? So let's put it in that way. So if you didn't use, this stimulation or this memory, you will lose it. So you just forget it. by default. But there is more and more evidence that actually, I was talking before about the LTD. The LTD could be a way how to destroy a memory. And for that, you need energy, right? So I told you that for LTP, you need a specific kind of stimulation. But for LTD, it's not that you don't have stimulation. It's you need another pattern of stimulation. So if you think on that, that is also energy, right? So you are using energy for remembering. If we put it in the simplistic way, as I said before, LTP, memory, and an LTD, forgetting. But it's also you are using energy. So now you may think, well, so many millions of neurons, so maybe it's infinite what the amount of memories you can store, right? So we have there are some kids in the spectrum, right, that they can remember everything, so you may think, is that why they're autistic? That could be, it's a correlation. You don't know if it's it's a causality, right? But it's a correlation. They can remember crazy amount of data, but they have a behavioral issue, right? So so you may think, could be that the problem? I mean,
is that a cause or is it a symptom?
Yeah, exactly. It could be. So as we always say that you need to sleep well, right? So because there are important brain waves, right? So that are associated with kind of like a memory consolidation, right? So you have, I don't know, the gamma that are for more specific things, that you kind of like a highly executive stuff that you're doing. It's more associated with gamma waves. But the delta waves, who are the kind of like the slowest ones, are so important too, right? So it's
do you get that from sleep?
Yeah. So
is that how you rebuild?
I mean, you have a mix of all the waves during the sleep. You have REM and non-REM cycles, right? So you have different patterns, right? So you have the different kind of like a field potentials that you could measure with the EEG, and then could tell you in what phase of the sleep you are.
Yeah.
And there are some of them that are so important for memory consolidation. So that's why they say kind of like if you don't have REM sleep, there are experiments in mice, and they kind of like they are not well at the end when you stop the REM sleep. So you need that to consolidate memories, and you wonder whether that consolidation is just making those putting them in files. But what if you also have, we don't need this, we can get rid of that, and you have these little people inside of your brain, say, this is not important. We don't need the IKEA instruction, we don't need the name of this person because we just met them once and we're never going to see them again. So let's get rid of those things. And maybe in that way you make more space, it's like the defrag function that you used to have in the computers that you had to do by yourself before, so you had to go once in a while and do a scan disk and then a defragmentation of the hard drive, so you could get more space because it was full of kind of like spaces, in there. So your computer got slow. So
too many cookies.
Exactly, right? So you had to get rid of those things, to be able for the computer to work well. Maybe we're the same thing. We're not different than a computer, as we saw in the Matrix.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that sleep is imperative to memory consolidation. Is that where it's happening the majority of the time? Is any memory consolidation happening when you're awake? Or what's the theory around that?
I don't think it's just sleep. It's like what is believed is that kind of like during sleep, you have this consolidation process where kind of like the memory gets kind of like filed in the cabinet, right? But I mean, it would be hard to do the experiment because for doing the experiment, the person wouldn't sleep, right, the whole time, and then you would say, okay, so do you remember, and but maybe the person is tired, right? So it would be difficult to do experiment, but I don't think it's just associated with the sleep, again, if you can say it, it is possible. So I think just like as every part of the brain has something to do with memory, I think every process is important for memory too. It's like you need sleep. We all agree in that. Is that the only one part of the consolidation process? Maybe not,
Right.
but is one of the most important ones. And you see with sleep is not like a just associated with kind of like a better memory, but in general with better cognitive performance. And there are so many experiments about that. The typical experiment that they used to do, it was kind of like to do cognitive tasks, and this was the typical experiment. It was done with university students, so they pay them, and they get into a room, and they don't let them sleep, and they have to do cognitive tasks, right? And of course, you see, detriment of abilities to do whatever you need to do, right? So it is difficult if you don't sleep, and you see it in epilepsy too, right? So when the kids have problems with sleeping, they have more seizures, right? So if they have more seizures, they have more problems with sleep. So sleeping is so important, for memory consolidation, yeah, but for cognitive, for behavior, for stress, for you name it, right?
Yeah. So sleep obviously is imperative in restoring memory. What are some other things that can help restore memory? Or do you think there are future possibilities of inventions to help restore memory?
I think so. Like there are so many things that are being investigated now that can influence everything. I don't know. Like, for example, inflammation. Um, it is known, for example, with the stress, that you have more steroids. The levels of steroids, are higher, and that impacts on the inflammation. So the inflammation is bad for you, right? So it produces oxidative stress, and everything. And so at the end, that produces, I don't know, more calcium inside of the cells, cell death, those kinds of things. So if you think you could help, if you can modify the levels of steroids in your body, that could be beneficial. Can you do that? Yeah. There are many things that you can, like sports, meditation, anti-inflammatory food. Like it is the resveratrol of the wine, for example. All the purple foods, that they have components, in the purple foods, that you have carrots, you have potatoes, you have cabbage, you have so many purple foods, that produce, decrease the inflammation.
And why so? Why is it purple?
I don't know. I think it's the components, of the like a riboflavin and other components, that are enriched in those kinds of food. It's like the purple diets. So they are known to be beneficial to reduce the inflammation.
What would an example of a purple food be?
Oh, you have these purple potatoes.
Yeah.
You have
purple carrots.
You have cabbage. You have beets. There is a lot, actually. I heard a talk of a doctor, Dr. Daniel Graff, from Centara in Norfolk, and he was talking about the purple food that he wanted to try that for reducing the number of seizures. And
wow.
And we started doing that with my daughter.
What was the outcome?
So it is hard to say because,
Sure.
again, when you do an experiment, you have to control all the, the different things that are around. So it's hard to say that giving purple food, it was better, because there are other factors. But there are so many other things, like, for example, whey protein. There are the kind of like organic diets, gluten-free, lactose-free. all those things, there are different people, with epilepsy, for example, that use different combinations of those things, and they see a decrease in seizures. So with my daughter, for example, we see it. If we give her too much gluten, we see more seizures the next day. So we try to keep it low.
Yeah.
So if you think that your food can affect how you have seizures in your brain, seizures is not other thing that an unbalanced communications of cells.
Right.
So that means you are affecting the communication of neuronal cells. So if you can do it with food, you can do it with sports, you can do it with meditation. Again, you can do it, I don't know, with whatever.
Yeah.
I think there are so many things that you may think that can affect your eating chocolate. I don't know, you name it. There are, of course, those things won't work for everybody in the same way. But you have things, that could mimic beneficial things for your brain. So I wouldn't be surprised if those things affect the sleep too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Diaz, this has been a fantastic discussion on memory. You're so educated and just enthusiastic about it. I love talking with you on this subject. And thanks again for joining the podcast. And well, I would love to have you back again.
Thank you so much. It was super fun.
So many more topics that you and I could talk about.
Yeah, we need so many podcasts.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the CortiCare Podcast. And we will see you in the next episode.